covered public investing. So Elizabeth, I'm going to go to you and ask about as a private investor, how do you deploy capital for good?
Sure. So I've been entrepreneurial since high school when I started my first company. It was a jewelry business that led me to East Africa and helped start and scale a social enterprise over there for 6 years. And then ended up at the helm of the Phillips Foundation, where I'm on the other side of that table now, investing in companies like the one that I had helped build in those younger years. And so what I really focus on as a personal investor on the private side is women and girls and minority-run and led companies. I think Kelly mentioned it. I was backstage trying to catch what she was saying, but I think she threw out the stat that less than 2% of venture capital in this country goes to women-led ventures. And so that's almost exclusively what I do. And I don't see it as a charity project or, oh, let's throw them a bone. No, it's an opportunity, and it's a missed opportunity. And that's a statistic that is sadly not budged for many years now. And so engaging women investors to invest in women and girls. I love mompreneurs. People who have proximity to an issue are usually the most successful. They're solving for something, they know the problem, and they offer a solution, and those are really solid investments most of the time. So that's my focus on the private side. With the foundation, however, we invest across asset classes. We leverage our full endowment for impact, so we are 100% activated for impact across our full corpus, in addition to executing program-related investments with our 5% distribution, and we can talk more about that later on.
Great, thank you. So Sana, Pledge 1% is a powerful network and an example of the next wave of collaboration between for-profit companies. Can you share about Pledge 1%, the genesis of its formation, and how you are galvanizing more capital towards impact?
Absolutely. So Pledge 1% was launched in 2014 as really a brainchild of Mark Benioff of Salesforce and Scott Farquhar of Atlassian, to the goal really being to celebrate, foster, and inspire early-stage corporate philanthropy. So Pledge 1%'s vision is to create a new paradigm where social impact is ingrained and embedded into the DNA of every business, every entrepreneur across the board. And it's truly a movement. It's a movement of 18,000 companies in over 100 countries who use Pledge 1%'s flexible framework of investing 1% of their product, their profit, their equity, or their time, or some combination of that, to tackle some of the toughest social challenges. And specifically when it comes to the equity set aside, we're really creating a new norm for companies on the road to IPO, and to date have ignited $2 billion in philanthropy with that pledge type alone. The leaders of the Pledge 1% movement it's an invitation-only community of roughly 50 of our highest growth, high-growth tech companies, who we really think of as the force multipliers. They're the true leaders in the social impact space, who are not only just driving impact, but they're also kind of leveraging their insights and experience to inspire, educate, and empower. And looking ahead, it's really exciting. Pledge 1% has a robust and bold 5-year vision to ignite $5 billion of philanthropy, and through the equity set aside, to grow our general members from 18,000 to 50,000, and to grow our builders community to 100. And we're here to be aggressive on growth, because at the end of the day, we're tackling some of the toughest challenges of our time, and we know that business can be a force for good.
That's awesome. I love those goals.
Okay.
Teresa, I'm going to go to you next. You tend to work with multi-generational families of wealth and larger institutions, many of which are looking to drive impact with their wealth. Can you share an example of how you've helped others align their portfolio for impact?
Sure. So at AlTi, we've been doing this work for about 15 to 20 years, helping families and larger institutions move all of their portfolio into alignment with their values or their mission. So we start with a really deep exploration of who they are, how they feel about money, what they need that money to do with them, for them, and then what is their theory of change? What is the thing that they really want to drive in the world? We take all of that information and we build out a holistic kind of investment plan and portfolio that tries as hard as possible to get as close as possible to that theory of change. As an example, there's a large organization that I work with up in Washington State, and their mission as a foundation is to dismantle racism within the education sector. Yikes, right? There's no silver bullet for doing that, right? There's no one investment that we can make that will make that happen. It's an intractable problem. So what do? We break it down into its root causes. What are all the different ways and systems that prevent people from being able to access and thrive in the education system? And we do that throughout their portfolio. So kind of like Shaun was saying earlier, in the public markets, we can remove things that we know have historically driven racial inequities. So we take out things like private prisons, we remove payday lenders, and then we start working from there. We take into the educational sector some of the work that foundation's programmatic staff have led us to understand around textbook publishers that are offering unfair pricing to students, monopolistic testing organizations and all of their test prep materials that really are only affordable to a certain few, for-profit college education or educators, things like that. We start taking the things out, and then we start putting new things back in. So things that we know actually can provide more support to those students so that they can actually educate and thrive. So things like affordable housing, healthy food systems. We put in things around educational technologies that are really meant for underserved communities. We provide access to capital by low-interest loans going into community CDFIs or community development finance institutions so that all of those families can access capital the same way as everyone else. And from there, we just continue to build out that portfolio. We're investing in entrepreneurs of color. We're investing in technologies that are focusing on racial equity issues, and so on and so forth. So what you can see is it doesn't have to be as super myopic as only dismantling racism in the education sector. We can start tackling all of the root causes, and now that foundation can say, I feel really good about the fact that all of the assets in my stewardship are moving in alignment with this mission.
Thank you for that one. Elizabeth, I'm going to come back to you. The Phillips Foundation screens its portfolio through multiple lenses: affordable housing, the environment, gender. Can you talk about some of the key metrics you look at and how it's been able to create sustained impact?
Yes, and I'm glad to follow Teresa because she just walked through the process of how a lot of foundations and family offices like ours walk this path. It started with the negative screens for us. What did we not want in the portfolio? We didn't want to be a foundation trying to address certain things related to healthcare, but then being invested in tobacco products as an example. And so we started that negative screening process. And then we looked at the portfolio and decided to have an issue-agnostic approach. So we didn't want to limit the universe of things we invested in, but we apply a lens to our full portfolio, a gender lens, looking at an issue such as affordable housing and how does that intersect with women's rights or single-parent households. How can we address some of the social issues and wraparound supports needed to really solve for a problem with market solutions, but then also sometimes complementing that with grants and other partnerships with nonprofits. We look at the entire portfolio again through an impact lens, and we're constantly swapping out investments for higher impact products. This field has grown enormously. I've been in this role for 10 years, and when we started out on our impact investing strategy, private impact investing universe was about 700 billion. It's now about 1.2 trillion. And the global sustainable investments market was around 12 trillion. It's now 35 trillion. So this is mainstream. This is here to stay. When I was on stages like this a decade ago, telling everyone like I was a millennial prophet, this is going to happen. This impact investing thing is going to it's going to be around for a while, and that's proven true. This is the new normal, and it's what millennial investors and younger demand. They want their money to do more for them than just make more money, and they want to sleep at night knowing that they're making the maximum impact with the funds they steward. And that's certainly what we try to do at the Phillips Foundation.
Fantastic. Thank you all for those responses, and I hope you all are taking some good insights from the discussion today. I'm going to take a brief pause and just remind you, if you have any questions, to please visit the website, click on the live Q&A button and submit your questions there. So, Sana, I'm going to go back to you on this next question. You have a unique background coming from USAID and now being at Race for Good. What type of cross-sector collaboration are you seeing through your unique vantage point as Race for Good, at Race for Good, when it comes to impact investments that drive scale?
Thank you so much for that question. I believe at my core that in order to solve some of the most significant challenges, we have to work across sectors. And I think I'm an embodiment of that. My professional journey spans public, private, and nonprofit sectors and has really brought me to Race for Good and Pledge 1%. So I'll talk a bit about Raise for Good. Raise for Good is a cross-sector, impact-driven advisory group that partners with visionary leaders, whether that's funders, corporate or nonprofit leaders, to shape strategies to really accelerate organizational growth and transformation. Raise for Good is deeply committed to being people first, and our relational approach is what enables us to be bridge builders and conveners across sectors. We believe in shaping a new ecosystem where funders, corporations, and nonprofits collaborate to drive sustainable transformation. Pledge 1%, for example, is an example of one of those transformational corporate partners and an ecosystem builder. So that's truly changing the default in business. And as a strategic partner to Pledge 1% over the last 5 years, Raise for Good has co-created this growing organization from its infrastructure to its team, and really helped it emerge as a leader in the corporate social impact space. At Raise for Good, we are obsessed with outcomes and telling the story about impact. We've built new revenue-generating engagement programs that target CEOs and venture capitalists, as well as corporate social impact leaders, and have helped develop over 300 movement leaders. And so these programs, along with other storytelling opportunities and visibility campaigns, like we have a NASDAQ tower activation and bell ringing, which we're really excited to do around Giving Tuesday in November, really help CEOs, VCs, and employees really drink the Kool-Aid when it comes to embedding social impact into the fabric of the business. And the scale of this impact has been huge, and the global impact potential is massive. If we could all just stop and imagine a world where every company on the path to IPO sets aside 1%, 1% of their equity for social impact, we're talking billions, if not trillions of dollars that would be unlocked, that would go directly into the hands of nonprofits and community leaders who can affect lasting change. I love that. And that impact at the intersection of for-profit companies, founders, and philanthropy is why we're so deeply committed to our partnership with Pledge 1% and other transformational organizations, and just really believe in the power of working across sectors.
Thank you. Shaun, I'm going to turn it now. I'm going to turn the discussion towards human trafficking, which is one of the focus areas for Knowing Network. Do you have any examples of how investors have had an impact on key areas of injustice, or specifically human trafficking?
I do. Yeah, and so let me set the stage by reinforcing something that you just said. Just imagine a world where every company on their way to an IPO has certain standards, in accordance with what they're doing. On the other side of that IPO are public investors buying up the shares after they go public. And so they are actually setting the stage for what type of environment these private companies are on as they're going to an IPO. So again, reinforcing this idea that public investors have such a great impact on how companies operate. And a lot of these companies are big global companies. So I'll start with a negative example of a company. It's not directly related to human trafficking, but then I'll give you an example as it relates to human trafficking. There was a pharmaceutical company that really came on the scene in 2010. They hired a new CEO, and his sole strategy was to acquire other companies and acquire their assets, their drugs, and fire their research and development departments, and then just raise the prices of the drugs. Like, that's their sole strategy. And there were a lot of public investors that did not peek behind the curtain to see that that's what was going on. So this company actually had a remarkable stock. Like, it was like a meme stock from 2013 to 2015, just skyrocketed. But if you look behind and did a deep enough dive onto how they were actually making money, you would have a lot of people that held this company within their retirement accounts, within their portfolios that were put together by financial advisors. They were the owners in this company that on the other side of it, there was an interview with a guy that said, my wife has this rare disease. She relies on this particular drug, and the drug has gone up 500% over the last 6 months. We can't afford it. There is a chance that that guy held this company within his portfolio that he was investing in. Like, he was actually making money off it. And so whenever you draw that conclusion of, man, we just have to see the people side of even public investing and how these companies operate. We discovered a couple of years ago, Eventide is a little bit unique as our approach to investing in energy. We have guiding principles that guide all of our investing processes, where we believe that every human being was created with intrinsic dignity and value, and we cannot overlook that aspect. So there was a particular company that was in solar energy, and so we're kind of controversial. We will invest in some fossil fuel companies if we feel like that they are on the right path for all the things that we're wanting them to do, but we're also very bullish on renewables. And so we don't please anybody. Everybody has a problem with something that we're doing. So we actually had this lens of, we were very positive on the solar industry. However, one of our analysts, as he was doing research into one of the companies we were investing in, and he peeked behind the curtain and started looking at the supply chain of figuring out where the wafers that were put together to put together the solar panels that this solar energy company was distributing, looked and said, actually, there is one province within China that is using forced labor from a specific people group, and that is why this is so cheap. And it was something that we could not overlook. Even though we were bullish on the industry, we had to look at their practices and said, we can't overlook the fact that there are real people created with intrinsic dignity and value that are being forced into labor camps to put together these, what we think is a good product, but derived from these terrible means. And so we sounded the alarm and we said, hey, this is what this company is doing, and we would love to engage with this company again. We would love to be long-term partners with it. However, we just can't accept these practices. And a lot of other investors did the exact same thing, to where now we're trying to work on a solution with a lot of other investors to say, we've got to find another way to get these wafers into our solar panels. Love the solar panels. We're not willing to sacrifice human dignity in the process of getting them.
Mm-hmm.
So these issues that are being addressed are complex and seem intractable when you think about all of the things being covered. Teresa, I'm going to come to you next. We will hear some of the ways industry and philanthropy can support the mitigation of human trafficking, like Shaun just addressed, and offer dignity to survivors. But are there considerations for investors looking to create change? And is that even possible?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think you have to do a little bit more work. I think you have to dig deeper. A great example, Shaun. That was awesome. And I think one thing, as public investors, we should definitely be asking those questions. We need to dig into the supply chain. We need to also understand how they're treating their current employees, what practices and policies and behaviors they have culturally. If they're not doing what they need to be doing, you need to work as an advocate and an activist, as a shareholder, right? So we've done a lot of work where we're working with as shareholders on enforcing new policies or engaging them around their environmental practices or talking about their supply chains and asking those managers those company management to change. There's also a lot of ways that we could be looking at other things. So, for instance, when we look at something as deep and complicated as human trafficking, you have to go again and start looking at those root causes. What are the biggest issues in those areas? And how can we deploy capital, philanthropic capital? How can we deploy, low rate, intentional impact capital? How can we deploy market rate capital? All with that seamless intentionality around trying to drive a unified change, because it requires all of it. So let me give a couple of quick examples of ways that you could invest this way. So in addition to kind of the screens and even shareholder activism of public markets, you could also look at, for instance, one of the biggest root causes of human trafficking is around people who are refugees or intentionally displaced communities because of war, climate change, and otherwise. Those individuals oftentimes don't have documentation, they don't have their credit record, and now they're just forced into a new location. They don't have access to capital anymore. So we've invested in a fund that actually specifically targets low interest notes into these particular communities so they have access to capital. We fund them and then they can fund housing, they can fund businesses, and they can restart their lives. And those are paying back at an incredible rate, proving the proof of concept that refugees and intentionally displaced people are investable. You're giving them economic security so that they aren't as vulnerable to something like this. We invest in women in rural, developing regions who are farmers or otherwise small business owners, again, with very low cost, intentionally low cost capital. And in addition, we provide a lot of wraparound services to those individuals. So everything from bookkeeping skills to a wellness clinic for their kids, to, standard, state-of-the-art regenerative farming practices. All to make sure that those women can stay in their community, have the economic independence and resiliency to protect themselves and their families so that they don't fall prey. And then there's even things that are market rate, right? Where you can invest in technology solutions that were actually created by victims to provide better safety, maybe better financial security and inclusivity through things like fintech, right? So you have mobile technology and an ability to access financial markets on your phone. You don't have physical capital in your possession anymore. You're not actually falling into those safety traps that a lot of people, particularly in developing regions, are falling into, so that they can provide that economic independence and safety. So just a few examples of ways that you can try to deploy capital in these ways. But there's other things, right? There's poverty, there's food systems, there's racism, sexism, homophobia. All of those things are what lead to people being vulnerable in a situation that goes into human trafficking. All of those things have their own root causes and are investable.
Elizabeth, I'm going to come back to you. So Teresa just covered a number of topics. You've recently pursued being a crime victim advocate. And can you talk more about how that has infused your impact investing?
Yeah, so about half my life now, I've been involved in supporting anti-trafficking nonprofits, but just recently came to realize that my brother was likely trafficked. And he was a victim of child sexual abuse at Kanakuk camps in Southwest Missouri, a big mega camp. 20,000 kids per summer go there. And his perpetrator was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 30 years in 2010. But the victims were forced to sign an NDA, and the camp's narrative was that this was one bad apple who infiltrated our system, and we're really sorry for the victims, and let's move on. Well, my brother died by suicide in 2019, one of 16 suicides affiliated with this victim pool known to date. And so I got my certification in crime victim advocacy to start meeting with fellow survivors of camp abuse. The Kanakuk survivor community is now 200 people strong, and we know of 60 alleged perpetrators, 12 convicted, dating from 1958 to today. So it's starting to look like it's pretty organized. And what's so startling and disturbing, in addition to just the idea of children being abused from the ages of 7 to 17, which was my brother's case, is that as a parent, I would have sent my kid to summer camp if my family hadn't been through this. And so one of the questions I get asked a ton is, how do I diligence a daycare, a school, a camp, a youth stewarding organization, a church? And what needs to, I think, be more publicly known and available are those types of tools where we can empower ourselves as consumers, as parents, to ask the right questions. So this journey has led us at the foundation to start peeling back the layers of how did something this atrocious happen? And hopefully Kanakuk's an extreme example, but what we now know is that 18 states don't require criminal background checks on summer camp counselors. 10 states don't require day camps to be licensed. And in a state like Missouri, they didn't even require basic health code, fire safety, standard checks in the name of religion. If you're a religious institution in Missouri, you don't have to be regulated in that way. And parents just don't know. So I think it's important that in addition to shareholder advocacy, in addition to grant making to nonprofits, that we ask the right questions as conscious consumers. And that's how this whole impact investing movement really began, was people saying, we want more transparency. We want to know what our money's doing in the world so that we can decide if that fits with our values. Or we give that place our business or not, dependent on if it fits with our values. And so now in a world that's so globalized, with so many tools at our fingertips, and iPhones have access to the internet in a flash, we can ask those questions and get that information really quickly. And so I think the tide is starting to turn around transparency demands and what both consumers and investors deserve and want to know.
Thank you for sharing that. So now we're going to turn to questions from the audience. And I believe I'm going to be getting some questions here that have been submitted. Okay, thank you. All right, so we have time for more questions if you have them, but we have one here. panelists, and I'll let all of you decide if you have something that you would like to contribute here. What are some challenges with getting corporations to support social impact initiatives? And what strategies have you found effective with gaining buy-in?
I'll go first. Okay. We have specific teams at Eventide dedicated to engaging with companies. And the posture that you take when engaging with companies is very important. Not taking an adversarial approach, but rather a partnership approach. Saying this is going to be good for both of us. And this is going to be good for the people that it impacts. So I think a lot of times corporations, especially public corporations, are nervous about taking on any kind of social initiative because it's seen in opposition to being a profitable company. And to assure them that this is what shareholders want. We want you to treat your employees with dignity. And actually, we think that that's going to be good for you in the long run. Like, they tend to be more motivated and they stick around longer and they end up, putting fuel back in the tank. It's a good way to treat people. Same thing with your customers. Same thing with your suppliers. Same thing with your host communities and the environment and society more broadly. Looking at all of your stakeholders and making the investments in them. Some corporations need to be reminded that shareholders realize that, and we're not going to punish you for taking on those initiatives. So I think, coming alongside corporations, that is one of the challenges, is what will our shareholders think? What will our board think? And us saying, no, we're shareholders that care a lot about making sure that the returns back to our investors are impressive. And even though we care about that, that is why this is important. So I think that's probably one of the challenges that we face.
And I have an example to bring this to life a little bit. So one of our core operating businesses that my husband and I steward is a real estate company, and we build multifamily developments across the Southeast. And there was one of our properties under construction, and we uncovered that there was trafficking occurring through subcontractors on that site. And fortunately, our company had been trained in trafficking awareness to understand the signs that the woman who you were saying is suspicious is likely a victim. Law enforcement may or may not know how to handle that. And again, why I'm grateful to have my victim advocacy certification to understand how to aid law enforcement in walking with victims through this process if they want to get out of that situation. So one thing we tell fellow companies, and we've done this in the North Carolina Industry Association at their big conference, is to audit your practices internally for where are the vulnerabilities, where could you spot trafficking. In a chicken factory, they were bringing in, this is an example that Polaris cites quite a bit, they were bringing in young Venezuelan boys at 1 a.m. to clean the factory, and they were in hazmat suits essentially, so no one could tell they were children. And so until someone blew the whistle, they were definitely trafficking boys in their operation, and the owners didn't really know. It was just a few small, whoever subcontracted that group. Happens at hotels with housekeeping. It's everywhere, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I'm so grateful that NOMI does educational symposiums like this, because I think there's so much more we can do individually and corporately with the platforms that we lead or work within. So just an example to highlight that.
And I can add on to that as well. I think one of the things that we hear from a lot of our kind of corporate partners and a lot of, especially in our Builders program, who are really the leaders in the social impact space, is that it's difficult to measure the social, difficult to measure the impact. I remember when I was in the government, when I was at USAID, every dollar is accountable to taxpayers. So that was the first thing that we worked on with any program. But I think it's a lot harder, and there's lack of data and lack of standardization. And this is something that Pledge 1% and Raise for Good that we're tackling. We're actually in the middle of a social impact measurement benchmarking series. We just held a convening with about 60% of our builders community last week, where we brought in an expert to really think through this. How can we help these companies tell the story? Because at the end of the day, we're in a tough budget environment. Budgets are being cut, a lot of teams are moving, and a lot of our social impact leaders, in order to get the money to be able to do this great work, we have to be able to show that impact. And so that's something that we're working on. We're actually putting the toolkit together.
Okay, one last thing. I'm just going to double down on a couple of things that they said here. Two things. One, I think as corporations and investors in those corporations, we're entirely too myopic. We're always looking at quarter-over-quarter earnings and how do we drive quarter-over-quarter earnings, and forgetting that like sometimes those investments that may drop you in a quarter are actually long-term investments to improve your overall share price in the long run. So if you're smart about your employment practices, who you're bringing in, how you're training them, what kind of a culture you're bringing them into, you're going to massively reduce your overall HR costs. If you're smart about your resource utilization in terms of how you're using water, electricity, and so on, you're going to be actually better for the environment, likely, and you're going to reduce your improve your bottom line. And then lastly, if you have good governance practices, you're probably not going to get sued by the government or anybody else in terms of like making sure that you're putting good practices out into the world. So those things that, this whole ESG kind of mindset that is getting a lot of headlines these days, is actually just better risk management. It's smarter investigation, and we need to do a better job of it. And frankly, like consumers are demanding it. There's a ton of great data. There's a ton of great data out there that shows that those companies that are engaging in those practices have better brand loyalty, better pricing power, and actually are better companies. Those that get into trouble on those things, their price can oftentimes take a decade or more to fully recover from. So there's a ton of great research out there on why this is an important practice and why the market is moving in such a direction, but it's sometimes hard for certain industries and certain corporations to be able to fully adopt.
Mm-hmm. All right, we are running up on time now for our panel, so thank you so much, Shaun, Elizabeth, Hussain, and Teresa for your insights and all the work that your organizations are doing. Thank you all for attending this session. This is great and inspiring work, and this is all going towards a more equitable and sustainable future through investing, and I'm sure the audience picked up some good insights here. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly Gage, who's going to move us into our next session. Thank you.